They pulled out his fingernails and applied electric shock to sensitive private parts of his body. I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
Desert Storm is launched. 135,000 Iraqis are killed. An estimated 1 million Iraqis, many of them children and old people, then die as a result of 10 years of sanctions.
Helen Knowlton selected her as a persuasive witness to this atrocity, and it was all part of a campaign to turn Saddam Hussein, at least in the public consciousness, into Adolf Hitler. And the feeling was that they couldn't sell the Gulf War without this.
Soon after we arrived in Kuwait, 2 weeks after the liberation, it became apparent that the story was a complete hoax. We were able to go around the hospitals to count the incubators and find that, possibly with one or two that had been misplaced, that none were missing.
What are the chances of a 15-year-old girl who speaks perfect American English with no accent being in a Middle Eastern neonatal intensive care unit when Iraqi soldiers come in? Listen again. There's no accent, and Valley Girl doesn't count.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
This shows a phenomenon where people take off their thinking caps when presented with a terrible story which justifies war.
People take off their thinking caps when presented with a terrible story which justifies war. And that's the new narrative. It's war today. This is what we're going to be dealing with today on Armor of Truth Live number 165. Food shortages, refugees, fighter jets, the Great Reset versus the gospel. Welcome, folks, to the show. We're very happy to be here with you today. Serious times in the world today. We showed you that clip at the beginning. Those of you who are a little younger may not be aware of how exactly the United States became involved in Iraq. Well, the people, at least back then, they still had to have, and even today, you still have to have the will of the people on your side. That's one thing that's still true. The will of the people have to be behind these movements because we so severely outnumber this small group of people that want to take control of the world and move things the way they want it to move. They still need the will of the people. So in order to get the will of the people or to compel the people, propaganda is used. Now that story, that what clip you saw at the beginning was a complete fabrication. The young lady was a family member of someone who, of the ambassador, the Kuwaiti ambassador. I believe it was the Kuwaiti ambassador. And she was living in the United States. And it was a marketing firm from right there in near Washington, D.C., there in Virginia, who put that together, along with many other stories, to get the people lathered up, to get us all fired up. Certainly we can't have them throwing babies out of incubators and to die on the cold floor. We have to go to war now. It never happened. And so today we consider the message today, my friends, is please be very, very careful with your emotions. Don't let your emotions get carried away with what you're seeing in the news, what's being reported in the media. For instance, Russia bombs Ukrainian maternity hospital as mothers and children flee to basement. Does this sound familiar? Now, I don't know if this really happened. But what I do know is that the mainstream media lies. They have a very hard time telling anything that's true. Okay? So let's just be very careful about all of this. But this is a story. A maternity hospital has been struck by shelling in Ukraine. As mothers and children took cover in the basement, the Russian airstrike hit a residential area of the city of Zhytomyr yesterday, killing at least 2 people. Ukraine's emergency services said a cruise missile landed on an apartment building near Pavlychenko Hospital, according to the Kiev Independent. The strike damaged the hospital, breaking the windows and burned 3 homes. Powerful explosions. Ukrainian activist Daria Kilinyuk said newborn babies and their mothers were evacuated to the basement. And this brings us deeper into the story, because what we're hearing here is stories like this. The U.S. has seen very credible reports of intentional attacks on civilians. That's the narrative today. Vladimir Putin is targeting civilians. I don't know if he is or not. I'm not here to tell you what Putin is and isn't doing. I don't know. But I know the media lies, and I know we have to be very careful with our emotions. And here's another point. If we put these media, if we hold the media narratives, the different narratives, up beside one another and compare them, well, over here we see back in February 24th, before or right as the invasion was beginning, the Ukrainian government handed out weapons, automatic rifles, all kinds of weapons to civilians. What does that mean when you hand weapons to the civilians? To the force that's to the opponent, that means that everyone is now in play. They don't know who is a soldier and who is not. So there can be no humanitarian corridors any longer once you arm the citizens, once you arm the civilians. Now, I'm not criticizing that movement. Maybe that's what you have to do. But the way the media reports it to us, they're targeting civilians. Well, whose fault is that? So once again, let's just be extremely careful with this narrative, because for sure, the leaders that we have in place right now, the United States, Canada, these allies, they want war. No question about it. Don't believe anything they say if they happen to suggest that they want anything other than war. They don't want peace. They want war. Here's Lindsey Graham from 2016 in Ukraine. Listen to these words.
Your fight is our fight.
Ваша боротьба – це наша боротьба.
2017 will be the year of offense.
2017 рік буде ріком нападу.
All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia.
Ми всі повернемося до Вашингтону і ми будемо відстоювати санкції проти Росії.
Enough of a Russian aggression.
Досить вже російської агресії.
It is time for them to pay a heavier price.
There you go. Enough Russia aggression. It's time for them to pay a heavier price. The point we're making here to you is that this, my friends, is not some thing that just happened out of nowhere with an evil Vladimir Putin invading a nation. This has been building for a while, and our leaders have done nothing but provoke it. At a public press event with the Munich Secretary Conference, Kamala Harris, before the invasion, encouraged Ukraine to become a member of NATO. She said on the record, meaning Vladimir Putin would easily be able to hear this comment. She says, quote, I appreciate and admire President Zelensky's desire to join NATO, unquote. What message does that send to Vladimir Putin? Now, I'm going to read for you some more of Putin's justifications for his actions a little bit later in the show today. You're going to see, once again, folks, we're not innocent here. We've met the enemy, and he is us. So what message does that send to Putin? He says, go ahead and invade Ukraine. That's a provocation. And of course he did just that. So the invasion was no surprise, not to anyone in the Biden administration, that is for sure. They knew it would happen. That was the point. But why in the world has the United States intentionally sought war with Russia? Why? How could we possibly benefit from it? And some may have answers to that. Whatever the actual answer there is, and we can talk globalism, we can talk imperialism, we can talk all kinds of things, but it's obvious that Washington has been fixated on war with Russia for a long time. Also, we see U.S. troops accumulating in Europe in the surrounding regions. Pentagon has deployed some 12,000 troops to NATO member nations. So we constantly hear, well, we don't want to institute a no-fly zone over Ukraine and actually, stop the death and destruction because we don't want to actually have a war with Russia. We're at war with Russia, right? Don't get it twisted. If Russia sent 12,000 troops to train in Mexico just across the border, how would you think that would affect the United States? What would be done about that? How would you feel about that? All right. Now, from the Christian, the American or the Western Christian perspective, we have two perspectives. We have the liberal position, and then we'll have the Christian, what we'll just call the traditional Christian perspective. First of all, let's see, this piece we're going to hear from Skye Jitani. He's a writer for Christianity Today. And I want you to hear these comments about Vladimir Putin.
Loving neighbor has the guardrails of not hurting your neighbors, and loving your country does not have the guardrails of not hurting your neighbors if they're not in your country. Anyway, so Zelensky. Yeah, Zelensky is now a hero because he's standing up for Ukraine, and he went viral for his.
Skye Jitani is the gentleman in the bottom right-hand corner, and he's the comment that we're going to analyze here.
Video on the street of, I'm not leaving, I don't want the ride, I want ammunition. And it was very inspiring. Like, yeah, he's a new hero. And so several people have said, see, Phil Vischer, you were wrong about patriotism. You were wrong. And they've actually, a couple of people even retweeted my original tweet of saying how nationalism and patriotism can lead to bad things and aren't a biblical imperative.
Okay, now this is the narrative here, nationalism. They're going to use the term Christian nationalism. All right, we're going to deal with that in just a moment. We're going to help you understand what do they mean by that and why are they being duplicitous on this. But let's get to this first comment.
This is how Phil Vischer was wrong. Are also driving Vladimir Putin on the other side. So yes, it's good that the patriotic Ukrainians are rising up to defend their sovereignty, and defending your sovereignty certainly isn't a bad thing. But at the same time, it's
right here it is,
which they never do. Finland might get it's an interesting question whether Vlad the Impaler, whether Putin overextended himself and made some assumptions that didn't turn out to be true. What are your thoughts since you recorded with Mr. French?
Well, I can't claim to have any expertise whatsoever about geopolitical realities in Ukraine and Russia. All I know is what other people are also seeing on television and in the media. But other than the humanitarian horrors,
now that's the truth. First of all, he doesn't know anything about what's going on the ground there, except what he's seen in the media. But he's going to speak authoritatively about it right now.
And crisis that are unfolding, and the refugees and the people caught in the middle of this completely unnecessary war, which is tragic. I do find myself inspired by the response of the Ukrainians.
Now, as you watch the media movie that we're all being shown, of course you would be inspired. I find myself liking Vladimir Zelensky as I watch him. I catch myself and I listen to this guy. He's got it together. Then I have to remind myself, hang on a second. This is theater.
Resistance from the president on down to, old women in the streets. Like, they are just an inspiring example of resistance.
Remember, don't forget the clip that we opened with here today. If you're just joining us, remember, now you'll want to see, I'll show it again here a little bit later in the show. But the propaganda that we're used to seeing, we have to apply that right now. We cannot be irresponsible with this.
And I also wonder if this is actually the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
Not just because the Ukrainian resistance will cause him to pay a great cost with the military, but the way the world is uniting now against him and isolating Russia, it's a little too late. But it's not too late. But it would have been better had they done this sooner. But he may actually have just killed his own future. And I hope that's the case. One of the things that strikes me about this whole thing, when I kind of put my pastor hat on, is
okay, let's pay attention. Sky Jatani is going to speak as a pastor to us now.
It's a reminder of how much of the world is affected by the deep, sometimes dark motivations of a single human soul. Right? Something deep in the soul of Vladimir Putin is broken and evil and pursued this completely unnecessary war. And look at what's unfolded because of one man's brokenness.
Yeah.
Look at what's unfolded because of one man's brokenness. If you feel the instinct to follow the narrative that Vladimir Putin is evil, and he's the only evil involved in this whole thing, this is a good opportunity to I guess, rebuke a brother. Take a moment to be humble. Quiet humility for one moment to reflect on the truth, the biblical truth. And as you think about Vladimir Putin, as you think about anyone involved in this, there, but for the grace of God, go I. What would you do? What would you do? How would you be responding? Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that thin line between good and evil runs through all of our hearts. All of our hearts. So to sit back and point out the evil as though it's not also in my heart, well, this is not as simple as the good guys versus the bad guys. It's not that simple. But there is a divide even among Christians here. The left-leaning, or what we'll call liberal Christianity today, and what we'll call, I'm going to boldly call, real Christianity, true biblical Christianity. The reason I say that is because the folks we're looking at here have been, over the past couple of years especially, been involved in pushing forward the social justice gospel, filtering the gospel through the lens of the oppressed. We'll talk about more of that a little more at another time. But let's look at a comment from Owen Strachan. He says, I have a serious question for thought leaders on the evangelical left. Why is nationalism great in Ukraine, but evil in America? It's not hard to see, folks. It's not hard to see. The duality, or the dual nature, or the contradiction running in the minds of those on the left. Owen says, nationalism done biblically is not in fact evil. And that's what they go on to talk about in that previous podcast about Christian nationalism. Associating anything with supporting our own nation as as somehow being a Donald Trump supporter, associating, and of course Donald Trump being associated with Vladimir Putin. You see where this leads. But Owen says, nationalism done biblically is not in fact evil. It's right and good to be a salt and light kind of citizen wherever you are. It's biblical to seek the good of the city where you live. So reject this pervasive, neither left nor right quietism that the evangelical left has dumped into the church's water. He says it is evil. He says, they tell us that it's evil to love the country of America. The leftist thought leaders will tell us. But that it's glorious to love Ukraine somehow. If you love America first, then that's white supremacy. But to love Ukraine is goodness itself. Now, in Owen's new podcast, he says he explains why this is, using formal theological language. But as he says here, what we've just heard from some of the folks of Christianity Today, is hot nonsense, to quote Owen Stragan. So, moving right along. So, before we get into our main event today, where we're going to show you the heart of the Western media propaganda complex's most likely next move with Ukraine's sitting duck president, and why a Christian should pay attention and not take sides on this media event. We should pray for all the people involved, especially the leaders and the people who have been uprooted because of Joe Biden's horrible, non-existent foreign policy. Before you go blaming Vladimir Putin, check your own heart first. Check your own town, city, state, and nation first. It's the foreign policy of the United States that caused what we see happening right now. Now, we've told you from the start here that the United States or the West and its allies want war. They want war with Russia. And sadly, this story is breaking harder in our favor with every day that goes by. But that's why we're Armor of Truth. We don't play favorites. Hard times are coming. The signals are clear. The United States is in decline, and a new world order is shaking out and being established right now. Personally, I don't think that the globalists are quite in sync with one another enough yet to establish their complete agenda, their complete goal of a world order. Not yet. In fact, I think something much worse is playing out, much worse than a global order. With the amount of sheer lying that takes place in any one day of news and throughout the year of world events, governments are less and less reliable, and more people seem to be realizing this. Now, this is good in a way, but it's also bad because the United States is no longer a Christian nation. And the percentage of the 2 billion or so Christians in the world who are, the percentage of that 2 billion who are truly converted, Holy Spirit-filled followers of Christ is clearly very small. The most common form of Christianity in the world today just happens to be the United States. Number one religious export, the prosperity gospel, word faith movements, and like animals. Because these Christian heresies are accepted as the truth worldwide, we find ourselves in a great time of deception, as well as judgment from God. I say this to tell you that we are severely outnumbered in the world today. Take Ukraine, for example. The country is thought to be Christian with its Eastern Orthodox foundations. However, they're battling among themselves. But this is not a representation of what is known as the believing church, the true church. At best, this is a form of social religion or cultural identification. In the areas of Europe where the Reformation took hold and transformed the world, secularism has now taken over as the dominant worldview. Likewise, growing faster than ever are forms of Eastern mysticisms and religions like Buddhism or just general mysticism. In other words, the world is in great trouble at the moment with no real leaders and no true direction. Now is the time for Christians to do what we've been called to do: preach the gospel that transforms hearts to every creature on earth. Now that's a movement that God can bless. Revolutions for the sake of freedom in the name of human autonomy, that is not a movement that God is likely to bless. However, that is the nature of most of the truth, liberty, and freedom movements that we see rising up in the world today. In fact, the anarchist movement is bigger than ever. And it might be understandable, right, that anarchy seems to be more popular today, given the putrid condition of the world's greatest governments. But it's not good news. Anarchy is an antichrist spirit. It's a rejection of absolute truth in exchange for relativism, and this has nurtured. Now it has nurtured a couple generations who are restless, confused, and do not have the language or the skills to express their needs without rage. This will hurt us sooner rather than later, and this is why today, as a part of this presentation, I want to compel you all to consider this exhortation. First, preach the truth of Christ with all your heart to as many as you can. Second, prepare yourself and your family for the hard times that seem to be approaching. For those of us in the West, austerity and scarcity will be a new concept. Preparation is now mandatory. When a superpower like the United States declines, the ripple effect in the world is catastrophic. We saw it during the pandemic. The globalists have been pushing the Sustainable Development Goals so hard over the last few years that they have actually convinced farmers to retire and stop growing crops and raising livestock, as they say, to save the planet. Well, their planet-saving actions are now proving to be humanity-threatening. There's nothing wrong with conservation. However, that's not what we see happening in this global green movement. There's nothing rational about it. It is completely emotion-based and serves nobody but the corporations who promote it and the politicians who enact it. The actual people in the world are harmed by this movement. With the war in Ukraine, it's very likely that Europe's grain and fossil fuel energy requirements are going to be deeply affected. We've already seen it. And when the need gets bad, it will be discovered that the green movement's plans to save the earth by halting farming, shutting down fossil fuels, has been a terrible idea, in fact, deadly. So when Europe's need radically increases, North America's need won't be far behind. Fuel prices and food shortages could very well combine to create a time of austerity in the West that hasn't been seen before. So I recommend to you, please find Ice Age Farmer on YouTube and at his website, iceagefarmer.com, for good advice on this issue and how to properly prepare your family for this likely crisis that we pray doesn't arrive. I don't know if the globalists really want a food crisis, but it sure does play into their hands quite well, since they also control the narrative by having all the media bought and paid for. It's easy for them to make a mistake like causing a real food shortage, if that's what's happened. It's easy for them to take a humanitarian crisis and blame it on the average working man in the world. And then to compel the world to get behind their solutions, which for some reason always seem to lead to less and less liberty and more control for them. Interesting how their humanitarian movement actually seems to be anti-human. Ukraine normally exports tremendous amounts of food and is known as one of the most important bread baskets in the world. Globally, the price of wheat is up 55% over the last couple weeks. So these shortages will include also animal feed. So this affects livestock as well. Russia is also a huge producer of agricultural products worldwide, but has now been crippled by sanctions from the West. See, we provoked them into action and then we sanctioned them. Right now, the global price of food is the highest that it's ever been. And Russia and Ukraine normally account for about 1/3 of the world's wheat and barley exports. Russia and Ukraine, 1/3 of the world's supply of wheat and barley. Some regions will surely see immediate shortages. Now, Syria, which is another hot spot on the globalist war hawk agenda for sure, recently announced food rations. Lebanon is also struggling to meet their demand as Ukraine provides 60% of their supply. Currently, they're trying to make deals, Lebanon's trying to make deals with the United States, India, and Canada to pull themselves out of free fall. Ukraine supplies the European Union with almost 60% of its corn and nearly half of a key component in the grains that's needed to feed livestock. China. The condition of China's winter wheat crop could be the worst in history. China just happens to be the world's biggest consumer of wheat. The USDA, right here in the United States, the USDA is reporting that 71% of all winter wheat in the United States has been affected by drought. Here's the takeaway. We have a hard time feeding the world even when conditions are ideal. Even in the best of years, we have a hard time feeding everyone in the world. And this is not going to be, it is definitely not going to be one of the best years. So be smart. We're not fear-mongering here. Just be smart. If you don't have food stored, store what you can now and just keep it simple. As you store food, think calories and protein. Have basic medicines and herbs on hand. I'm not an alarmist. I'm not even a prepper, but I'm taking this one seriously. Because austerity measures seem to be in the plans for us. Austerity measures are specifically mentioned in the Agenda 21 Sustainable Development documents that anyone can read for themselves on the United Nations website. Now, let's be honest, brothers and sisters. The world is currently in the hands of people who do not seem to be capable of telling us the truth, who have let their greed drive them to madness, and are also incapable of actually solving any real humanitarian emergencies. Maybe they don't even want to solve them. Whenever your governments are training their military to call men women and women men, and your physicians are being trained to do the same, folks, we're in a new level of depravity. World Bank President David Malpass is openly admitting that we are now facing a huge supply shock as a result of the war in Ukraine. Worldwide food prices in February were over 20% higher than they were in February 1 year earlier. Fertilizer prices are way up. Crop production is down all over the world due to unusual weather patterns. Now, obviously, that will be blamed on cow farts and the unwashed masses driving back and forth to work, rather than the atrocious management of these people who are in charge. Also, supply chain problems that really seem to have been purposefully caused if you really paid attention to what was going on during the pandemic, and ships sitting off the coast with goods just sitting there and no one to receive them. We were willing to call out the military when we needed to disperse or disseminate vaccines all over the nation, but we didn't seem to think it was all that urgent to get the ships into port. Is it by design? It sure seems to be. And now the U.S. government is foaming at the mouth to pop off World War III. That could very well exacerbate the global food crisis to a level that we've never seen before. So be smart. Be ready. There are plenty of resources, even just on YouTube, for you to learn how to prepare yourself for, a few weeks. Just get a few weeks of stuff put back at least. War exposes Europe's failure to heed warnings over Russian gas. Now, this has to do with energy and the Sustainable Development Goals. The Russian invasion of Ukraine couldn't come at a more sensitive moment in the European Union's energy debate. The bloc is looking at how to implement its goal of reaching climate neutrality. Climate neutrality, what a weird term that is, by 2050. As energy prices soar and the closure of German nuclear plants adds to concerns about energy security. Let me tell you, if these people were really interested in clean energy, they would be firing up nuclear plants all over the place. But they're not. They're shutting them down. They're not interested in clean, inexpensive energy. They're interested in power. German Economy Minister Robert Habeck said reducing dependency on Russia won't happen overnight, though the war in Ukraine has heightened the resolve. He says, quote, we've gotten ourselves into quite a corner there, but we want to get out of it. So breaking their dependency on Russian energy, isn't this convenient? Isn't this convenient? And now that brings us to our main event for today. The propaganda of the new world hero, Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, this is a real shirt you can buy online if you wanted to. What are we looking at here? Is anyone catching on yet? Do we know what we're looking at yet? To make crowds act as one obedient group, those in charge have to get the group united at the unconscious level. To make crowds act as one obedient group, they have to be united at the unconscious level. The masterminds of mass formation, or what's known as crowd psychology, know this very well, and they have perfected this art. Symbolism is one of the most powerful tools to achieve this end. Similar names and even more similar logos, as well as similar stories, have appeared time and time again, almost like omens of what's about to come. If you know what you're looking at, you know what's about to happen. The fingerprints of those who run national, regional, and now global operations can be found everywhere on this thing. All one needs to do is pay attention and not give in to emotions. Pay attention and do not give in to your emotions when watching the news or reading mainstream reports on the conflict. And that goes for both sides. If you happen to be aware of what's going on in the world, you know what a false flag is. You know what don't give your emotions to that either. Don't get incensed and angry at what you're seeing. That's not going to help you either. Remember, God is sovereign. He's in control. He's restraining evil as we speak right now. And he could stop at any moment. This is why we need to be in prayer. But simple but effective tools like symbolism. Also simple, effective tools like appealing to emotion, appealing to one's perceived tribe, creating tribalism, depersonalizing some individuals, like Vladimir Putin, and building personas, actually depersonalizing the entire Russian nation. In the United States, I've even heard of some of our leaders saying that we need to deport Russian students. How progressive. And they work to build personas for others to make the masses easier to manipulate in order to get their full approval for whatever intrigue or debauchery the organizers have in mind. And more of this we can see here. Volodymyr Zelensky recently, now this is one of those news releases that went everywhere. It went everywhere. Every outlet seemed to have this story. Churchill with a social media account. That's what they're calling Volodymyr Zelensky. Zelensky's morale-boosting effect on Ukraine. This is from MSNBC. I think this is where they talked about this. They said, Morning Joe panel discusses how Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is remaining visible and defiant during the Russian invasion and the impact this is having on Ukrainian residents. This is why we have to be more careful than ever. We have to be very careful when we watch the news and we try to discern anything about what's happening in Europe right now. And we have to allow ourselves to be careful not to allow ourselves to be carried along by emotional stories that are presented. You don't know a tenth of what you might think you know about what's actually going on the ground halfway around the world. And that goes for both sides, conservatives and liberals alike. And you don't know a tenth of what's going on around there, especially if all you're relying on for information is legacy, network, and mainstream news outlets. Instead of intelligence agencies getting involved directly with these nations today, getting involved directly with their governments, and these news stories today, the Mockingbird, Operation Mockingbird, where the CIA had plants in the United States, in our own media to get the message that they needed to have out. Well, this was first done in other nations. But they don't do it that way today. It's not the CIA anymore. It's non-governmental organizations that do this work of narrative control under the guise of humanitarian relief or humanitarian aid. Think USAID, for example. I think the other one was the Democracy Project. But in a previous video that we did here last week, we've already discussed George Soros' involvement in Ukraine and his eagerness to explain his direct involvement in having Volodymyr Zelensky placed in the office of president in Ukraine. This is where the next chapter of our coverage of this current media war begins. The activist martyr has now blossomed up into the president martyr. The same tactics that were used to run the 2014 Maidan revolution in Ukraine are being employed right now, again, but on a global scale. The individuals and groups that foment and funded color revolutions in Ukraine have been doing this for a long time, and they've just upped the ante. They came in around the issue of propaganda. They studied how to create hot-button topics for the American people. They have been successful in compelling the American people to support all manner of political intrigue and military intervention all over the world. They were able to get the American people fired up about Central America back in the 1980s in order to gain the full force of the United States military. Same thing in Iraq, which we just saw earlier, and many other examples. But they are dedicated to achieving their goals. They still want to get rid of certain governments. Regime change in Syria, regime change in Iran, and other places you've probably never heard of. They're very skilled at this, and they've been applying those same strategies now for decades. They have a lot of allies now inside the news media, inside the government, and that means they can do a lot to control the narrative of any story. In America today, we have convinced ourselves that somehow we're above this kind of manipulation. Whatever we've seen happen in other countries, like South America and Central Europe, we're just above that. That couldn't happen to us. We're too smart for that. Yeah, we do well to check that attitude. We are right now being propagandized to back a movement that ultimately plans to enslave the entire world in a benevolent despotism if it can. And they are currently winning the information war, as you can see clearly. Today, the leader of a country can be demonized in such a way that sells very well with the American people. So they don't have to argue policy anymore. They simply run a marketing campaign to attack leaders or build other ones up as heroes. It's perfect. They never have to explain why they're running a certain operation, because the American people are either so scared or so outraged that we're just willing to write a blank check to go and kill the bastard immediately. That's where we are. That's what you're hearing all around you today. You're hearing it from Christians. They have become eminently skilled at picking out leaders, finding their ugly traits, and then highlighting them for use toward their own goals. So when you follow the money behind these organizations that form narratives and push movements into the public's consciousness, you inevitably find names like George Soros and many others who are hard at work to bring about their goals by any means necessary. That brings us to a little clip here we want to share with you. I'm going to hopefully be able to play this. It's fair use. Only going to be for a minute or so, but I want you to listen to this piece right here.
You make him into a devil. He's totally corrupt and he's evil and he wants to kill people in the Maidan, these wonderful white-hatted demonstrators. So you've got a black hat versus white hat. You keep repeating that basic scenario. And it works with the American people.
You've got to realize what Vladimir Putin is. He's an old KGB colonel that wants to restore the Russian Empire.
You make them into demons, and the American people find that the way they can understand the world.
There you go. You make them into demons because that's so much easier. That's just so much easier to do than arguing policy or making a good case for why we should or shouldn't do this. No, just make a movie. The murder of politician Rafik Hariri is one example. Rafik Hariri in Lebanon, his murder led to the Cedar Revolution in 2005 in Lebanon. In Ukraine in 2004, Viktor Yushchenko was mysteriously poisoned before the Orange Revolution, and as it turned out, this was the candidate being supported by the Western elites. His poisoning served to lift him up to the position of what's known as a sacred victim, which many believe garnered the compassion of the Ukrainian people and led to his presidency. Likewise, sacred victims can be civilians, the elderly, children, babies in incubators. In the infamous color revolutions, it is the deaths of so-called peaceful protesters that affected the right attitude from the public to achieve the desired end. And we saw this in the United States in the summer of 2020 in spades all over the place. We saw a color revolution. It happened to be black. I'm talking in the color of the shirts, the Antifa and the masks. Trained agent provocateurs show up and set the protest off with violence, creating the perfect circumstances for sacred victims, also known as martyrs. We see the same tactics here used in America. Same tactics with police violence, as the victims, like George Floyd, are vaulted into sainthood almost immediately. Isn't it sad to see this, knowing what we know about it now, knowing the level of manipulation that's underlying it? In January 2014 in Ukraine, at the Maidan Revolution, Armenian-Ukrainian activist Sergei Negoyan. Now look at the similarities here. And this happens all over the place. It happens time and time again. Sacred victims, martyrs, 2014, in Ukraine at the Maidan Revolution, Armenian-Ukrainian activist Sergei Nagoyan was a well-known, well-spoken, good-looking, non-violent, even lovable protester. He fit the script perfectly, and he was used as such. The perfect candidate for martyrdom for the cause. He read patriotic poems. He just didn't know what cause he was actually representing. He had no idea what was going to happen to him. He read patriotic poems for the cameras. He was happy to pose as the face for his cause, he thought. And he became famous for his cause, and he unknowingly became the perfect opportunity for the moneyed elites to set off the movement they wanted with a timely martyr. Sergei was killed on January the 22nd, 2014, and the case has never been settled. Imagine that. How Sergei was killed to this day is unknown. Even though the Maidan was saturated with thousands of phones, hundreds of surveillance cameras, his body somehow arrived dead to the scene at the Maidan. That's called Independence Square there in Kiev. It arrived at the square as a well-timed sacred victim. No witnesses, and his body was immediately moved from the scene of the crime. Sergei immediately became the face of the movement, and the police were immediately appointed as his killers. Folks, can we wise up? Can we please wise up fast? We see what's going on around us. It's here in the United States. Same thing. It's not like you look at what they can accomplish over there in places far away from us. No, it's happening here too. The conflict was easily escalated into a violent uprising. This could just as easily be the narrative of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, which achieved the very goals that George Soros and others proudly declared on his now infamous CNN interview. Now, with this in mind, with all this in mind, I suggest to you, President Volodymyr Zelensky has shown up at the right time. Well-spoken, good-looking, lovable. Everyone in the world loves him. The lovable former funny man, actor, handsome, even by Hollywood standards, he's likable. A true charmer in his interviews with the press. He's arrived at the perfect time. The world has been told he's a hero, and before the war was 1 week old, the world had already enshrined someone they had never heard of as the hero of the new Russia-Ukraine war. Now that is some effective propaganda. What do you think is going to happen next? What is most likely to happen to this man? Now, I pray that it does not go down that way. I don't want to see that happen. I pray that if God wills it, He will intervene and end this madness today. But my friends, one of two things is likely going to happen to Zelensky. He's either going to be martyred for the cause of the globalists, for the allies, for NATO, or NATO will intervene at the last minute to mop up the region and then ensconce their hero as the Justin Trudeau of Europe. I think it's going to go one of those two ways and probably nothing in between. And so, is this man a hero? Certainly is likable, right? I mean, he's a likable guy. But who is he? Who is he? Thank you to one of our viewers and moderators, Ms. O, for helping us out with this piece of information. The Pandora Papers reveal offshore holdings of Ukrainian president and his inner circle. What we're going to find out here is the lovable new world hero is just another oligarch. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky rode to power on pledges to clean up the Eastern European country, but the Pandora Papers reveal he and his close circle were the beneficiaries of a network of offshore companies, including some that owned expensive London property. Some of the key points here. Ukrainian President Zelensky and his partners in comedy production owned a network of offshore companies related to their offshore, just meaning you can keep it hidden, private, so people don't think you have the wealth that you have. A network of offshore companies related to their business based in the British Virgin Islands, Cyprus and Belize. Now, we don't fault anyone for doing business and becoming wealthy, but let's be honest about it. Zelensky's current chief aide, Serhiy Shafir, as well as the head of the country's security service, were part of the offshore network. So, nepotism here, helping our own family out. Offshore companies were used by Shafir and other business and another business partner to buy pricey London real estate. Around the time of his 2019 election, Zelensky handed his shares in a key offshore company over to his comrade Shafir, but the two appear to have made an arrangement for Zelensky's family to continue receiving the money from the offshore venture. This is much like we see in the government in the United States and in the West now, the privatization of our government today, or the leaders being involved heavily in corporations and putting themselves in positions of power to benefit their corporations, and thus privatizing certain parts of the government, the public-private partnerships. Folks, they're not, at least with the people we have in charge, those are not for your benefit. So, this is where we are. What do you think is going to happen next? He appears to be just another, we can call him a puppet, but that might be too easy. He just seems to be not much different than Vladimir Putin himself. But he's the hero, according to the script. Now I want to look at Vladimir Putin's most recent speech in the video we did last week, our first video on this story, on the war. I read for you excerpts from Vladimir Putin's first speech justifying his actions. Now I want to read his speech from February 24th. And, all we want to do with this is when he makes certain claims, can we hold them up to compare it to what we've heard from our own media, hold it up to what the history that we can actually know, or what we can know relatively well, and just compare it. Is the man lying, or is he telling the truth? Let me go ahead and hit this disclaimer for you right now. I'm not here to defend Vladimir Putin. I'm here to be objective. And this is what it looks like. But in this country, when you're objective on this issue, you're immediately labeled a traitor, I guess, or a Putin supporter. You must hate Ukraine. None of those are true. In Putin's speech from February 24th, he starts off, citizens of Russia and friends. I consider it necessary today, and I'm going to read the whole thing. We're just going to highlight it. I consider it necessary today to speak again about the tragic events in Donbass and the key aspects of ensuring the security of Russia. Now, he says this over and over. Ensuring the security of Russia. So what we need to ask ourselves, does Vladimir Putin have a right to ensure the security of Russia? I will begin with our biggest concerns and worries, the fundamental threats which irresponsible Western politicians created for Russia consistently, rudely, and unceremoniously from year to year. I'm referring to the eastward expansion of NATO, and I want to remind you of the story we shared with you just a few minutes ago about Kamala Harris essentially provoking Putin just before all this popped off. He says he is worried about the expansion of NATO, which is moving its military infrastructure ever closer to the Russian border. These are facts. Does this movement of NATO, I'm asking you, does this movement of NATO actually make the world any safer? Does moving weapons, even weapons of mass destruction, closer to the Russian border, does it make anyone safer? It's just a question. Does it make the Russian people any safer? Has it made Ukraine any safer? Putin continues, it is a fact that over the past 30 years we have been patiently trying to come to an agreement with the leading NATO countries regarding the principles of equal and indivisible security in Europe. Now that is a concept that says each state has the right to defend itself, has the right to act if one of its neighbors begins to threaten it. It's just a maxim. It's just a principle that exists. It's part of the UN Charter. In response to our proposals, we invariably faced either cynical deception and lies or attempts at pressure and blackmail. Its military machine is moving and, as I said, approaching our very border. He asks, why is this happening? Where did this insolent manner of talking down from the height of their exceptionalism, infallibility, and all permissiveness come from? What is the explanation for this contemptuous and disdainful attitude toward our interests and absolutely legitimate demands? Now, we're not saying that I'm not trying to tell you that all of his demands are legitimate. Let's just take it here point by point. He says the answer is simple. In the late 1980s, the Soviet Union grew weaker and subsequently broke apart. It was enough to disrupt the balance of forces in the world. All this is true. He says, as a result, the old treaties and agreements are no longer effective. Entreaties and requests do not help. Anything that does not suit the dominant state, the powers that be, is denounced as archaic, obsolete, and useless. At the same time, everything it regards as useful and presented as the ultimate truth enforced on others, regardless of the cost, abusively and by any means available. Those who refuse to comply are subjected to strong-arm tactics. Putin says, what I'm saying now does not concern only Russia, and Russia is not the only country that is worried about this. This has to do with the entire system of international relations, and sometimes even U.S. allies. So what Putin is saying is because the balance of power has changed, that the rules of international relations had to change too. Putin continues. He says, however, this should have been done professionally, smoothly, patiently, and responsibly with due regard and respect for the interest of all states. Instead, we saw a state of euphoria created by the feeling of absolute superiority, a kind of modern absolutism. Wow. Can you disagree with him on that? Canada, United States have taken on for themselves, and the governments have taken on for themselves absolute authority. They have rejected the law of God. And they themselves see themselves as God, locking people down for 2 years, saying you can't go to church and worship. They have taken the seat of God and they're calling themselves God. And I think Putin called them out on it. I have to keep making this disclaimer. I'm not supporting Putin. Is he telling the truth or not? He said this, the kind of modern absolutism, coupled with the low cultural standards and arrogance of those who formulated and pushed through the decisions that suited only themselves. Keep that. Put that pin in the board. Low cultural standards. He says that a lot about the West. Here, Putin is making a commentary about the West and has a good point. The West has grown more and more immoral over the years, over the last few decades, to a point where now everyone can see it. It's beyond obvious. Now, this does not give Putin a moral high ground himself, right? He's got blood on his hands too. But what he's saying is true. Listen, if Adolf Hitler tells you that 2 + 2 is 4, he's telling you the truth, and you have to see it as truth. We have no righteousness, real or implied. We don't have any righteousness to stand on as we may have had in the past. Interestingly, this is a point not mentioned in the media right now because it's not conducive to the narrative that they're forcing upon us. Now, next, I want to give you this gets interesting. I'll show you where we're headed with this. You can see these characters right here. So coming up next here, Putin gives a rundown of the West's, the United States also, their less than honest dealings over the last few decades. He says this. First, a bloody military operation was waged against Belgrade, aircraft and missiles used in the heart of Europe. Yeah, that was the United States. That was the West that did that. Aircraft and missiles in the heart of Europe. He says the bombing of peaceful cities and vital infrastructure went for several weeks. I have to call these facts because some Western colleagues prefer to forget them, and when we mention the event, they prefer to avoid speaking about international law, instead emphasizing that it was necessary to break the rules. We're allowed. Next, there was this. Putin says, the illegal use of military power in Libya and the distortion of the UN Security Council decisions in Libya ruined the state, created a huge seat of international terrorism, and pushed the country towards a humanitarian catastrophe into the vortex of a civil war which has continued there for years. The tragedy, which was created for hundreds of thousands and even millions of people, not only in Libya, but in the whole region, has led to a large-scale exodus from the Middle East and North Africa to Europe. Is Putin wrong? Has this not happened? Are we not correct when we say and show with evidence for years now that the West and the globalist one world order has committed to a plan of sustainable development strategies and debauched foreign policies that have caused far more humanitarian tragedy than they have ever healed? Whatever you think of Trump, if we're being honest, the world was peaceful under his administration, although we do have that whole business of a mass vaccination experiment rolled out on the public, one that usually takes 10 to 15 years, that was rolled out in a year. We must ask the hard questions. Nobody's innocent here. Putin continues. A similar fate was also prepared for Syria. The combat operations conducted by the Western coalition in that country without the Syrian government's approval or United Nations Security Council sanction can only be defined as aggression and intervention. War hawks, my friends. We've been ruled by war hawks for decades now. And Putin is just telling the truth about this part. He says, but the example that stands apart from all these previously mentioned is the invasion of Iraq without any legal grounds. Now, by legal here, Putin means without a just cause, without actually being threatened in any way by the nation you're invading. He says, quote, they used the pretext of allegedly reliable information available in the United States about the presence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. To prove that allegation, the U.S. Secretary of State, that was Colin Powell, held up a vial with white powder publicly for the whole world to see, assuring the international community that it was a chemical warfare agent created in Iraq. It later turned out that that was all fake, and that Iraq did not have these weapons. He says, we witnessed lies made at the highest state level and voiced from the high United Nations rostrum, or the podium. He says, as a result, we see a tremendous loss in human life, damage, destruction, and a colossal upsurge in terrorism. This is a valid argument, one that the media used to make about our government when it was convenient or when it was politically expedient for them to make it. Does anyone remember the actual propaganda that was the fake final straw that caused the American people to, back in 1991, to back the invasion of Iraq, the first invasion? It was claimed that the Iraqi Republican Guard had taken a hospital in Kuwait where they ransacked the maternity ward, threw babies out of incubators, and left them to die on the floor. Now, for those of you who have joined us late, you might think I'm making that one up. You might be a little young. We'll play this clip one more time for you. lest we get the idea from our own media here that somehow we are the good guys.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
This is 1990, before the first Gulf War. Do you, the viewer watching this, notice anything odd about her testimony? I'll give you 5 seconds to say out loud what it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I was going to say no tears, but he goes a different direction.
5. She speaks perfect American English.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns.
What are the chances of a 15-year-old girl who speaks perfect American English with no accent being in a Middle Eastern neonatal intensive care unit when Iraqi soldiers come in? Listen again. There's no accent, and Valley Girl doesn't count.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
This shows a phenomenon where people take off their thinking caps when presented with a terrible story which justifies war. And
now, what do you think? Does anyone remember that? Any of you old enough to remember that piece? Right? That's what justified, ultimately, that was the final straw that justified the invasion of Iraq in 1991. A nation that had not threatened us in the least. Overall, it appears that nearly everywhere, in many regions of the world where the United States brought its law and order, this created bloody, non-healing wounds and the curse of international terrorism and extremism. Those are Putin's words. And they're true. They're true. All of our actions around the world today, the recent withdrawal out of Afghanistan left a vacuum there that's just created nothing but horror. Putin says, I have only mentioned the most glaring but far from the only examples of disregard for international law. Putin here says, to reiterate, they have deceived us, or to put it simply, they have played us. This type of con artist behavior is contrary not only to the principles of international relations, but also, and above all, to the generally accepted norms of morality and ethics. Where are justice and truth here? Just lies and hypocrisy all around. Incidentally, U.S. politicians, political scientists, and journalists write and say that a veritable empire of lies has been created inside the United States in recent years. It's hard to disagree with this. It is really so. But one should not be modest about it. Putin says the United States is still a great country and a system-forming power. All its allies not only humbly and obediently say yes and parrot it at the slightest pretext, but also imitate its behavior and enthusiastically accept the rules it's offering them. Therefore, one can say with good reason and confidence that the whole so-called Western bloc formed by the United States in its own image and its likeness is in its entirety the very same empire of lies. Now I ask you here, as you hear what Vladimir Putin's words, which we don't often hear in the media, at least not in full, Vladimir Putin's assessment of the immorality of the United States and its allies over the last few decades, knowing that he too has been a purveyor of many evils, who can you really trust today as far as world leadership goes? Who is actually in charge? In most of what we've just read, one evil man has called out our nation for immorality and evil, and he was right. Where does that leave us? The time for blind allegiance has passed, my friends. Now is the time for Christians to do what we have been called to do. It is the gospel that will change hearts, families, villages, towns, cities, countries, states, and nations, and ultimately the world. And it is only the gospel that will. Our calling is not to sit on the sidelines and watch it all crumble. Our command is to call the world to repentance and faith in Christ alone, to do it boldly, and to be willing to accept the consequences for doing it. It's not going to be a popular message, but then that's how we know it's the one we need right now. God will bless a faithful uprising of gospel-shouting saints. That we can count on. And now there's this. Putin says, properly speaking, the attempts to use their own interests never ceased until quite recently. They sought to destroy our traditional values and force on us their false values that would erode us, that would erode our people from within, the attitudes they have been aggressively imposing on their countries, attitudes that are directly leading to degradation and degeneration because they are contrary to human nature. Can you disagree with anything Vladimir Putin just said? He says this is not going to happen. He's talking about it in his country. This is not going to happen. No one has ever succeeded in doing this, nor will they succeed now. I might disagree with him there. I happen to think that what we see in the United States or in the West right now is a product of what was it called? During the Soviet Union, when the communists were in power, they would send, it was called active measures. There, it came to me. Active measures, where you don't fight war with bullets. You send agents into countries to demoralize, destabilize, then normalize things. That was Yuri Bezmenov's message. You go in and demoralize a nation, then you destabilize it, then you create crisis, and then you normalize. 4 steps to conquering a nation from within. I think we've been conquered from within. Look at your screen. It's clear. We've been demoralized. And we're being destabilized. And we see crisis now. The next step is normalization into a new position for the United States. A lower position. Putin is speaking directly here about the major movement of trans rights and gender reassignment drugs, for example, being given to our children, even without parental approval, and the general normalization of obvious depravity. As you see this man dressed up like a whatever that is, and reading a book about transgenderism to children at school. Is Vladimir Putin wrong about us? A general normalization of obvious depravity in this nation that was once known as the shining city on a hill to all the world. We've fallen from grace, my friends. Once again, this all comes out of the mouth of an unregenerate oligarch who came and told the cold, hard truth to us. Man, this is starting to get very Old Testament really fast. You know, where God's people were rebuked even by an unregenerate soul. So, this is what we're up against. Folks, we're not up against Russia. We're up against ourselves. We're up against our own immorality. Putin says, despite all that, in December 2021, we made yet another attempt to reach agreement with the United States and its allies on the principles of European security and NATO's non-expansion. Our efforts were in vain. The United States has not changed its position. It does not believe it necessary to agree with Russia on a matter that is critical for us. The United States is pursuing its own objectives while neglecting our interests. Now, this comes up over and over. It's really difficult to know for sure, but it seems like there is certainly a way to end this conflict, this war in Europe right now. And that's through diplomacy. That's through talking. We haven't been willing to do that. Those who aspire to global dominance have publicly designated Russia as their enemy. Make no mistake, they had no reason to act this way, says Putin. He says today's Russia remains one of the most powerful nuclear states. Now pay attention to this. Moreover, it has a certain advantage in several cutting-edge weapons. In this context, there should be no doubt for anyone that any potential aggressor will face defeat and ominous consequences should it directly attack our country. Now this is what he's saying. And our leaders are still provoking. They think it's necessary to provoke this to its ultimate conclusion. Putin says, even now with NATO's eastward expansion, the situation for Russia has been becoming worse and more dangerous by the year. Moreover, these past days, NATO leadership has been blunt in its statements that they need to accelerate and step up efforts to bring the alliance's infrastructure closer to Russia's borders. In other words, they have been toughening their positions. Putin says, we cannot stay idle and passively observe these developments. This would be an absolutely irresponsible thing for us to do. Can you disagree with him? For the United States and its allies, it's a policy of containing Russia with obvious geopolitical dividends. For our country, it's a matter of life and death, a matter of our historical future as a nation. This is not an exaggeration, Putin says. This is a fact. It is not only a very real threat to our interests, but to the very existence of our state and to its sovereignty. Now, you're going to hear that in the media, too. This is all about the sovereignty of Ukraine. What about the sovereignty of Russia? It is the red line, which we have spoken about on numerous occasions, and they have crossed it, says Putin. Everything you see happening in Europe right now is because it has been provoked. We have met the enemy, and he is us. It's time to own it. And all our Christian brothers and sisters on the left need to stop supporting the media narrative. It's time to stop with the emotions. The purpose of this operation is to protect people who for 8 years now, talking about in Ukraine, to protect people for 8 years now have been facing humiliation and genocide perpetrated by the Kiev regime. Now, to what extent that's fully true, I don't know. But a lot of what he's told us here is right on the money. All right? Just because he's an evil guy doesn't mean he can't tell the truth. We need to consider what's being said here. He says, to this end, we will seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Now, there are neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine. That is not unknown. That's not a secret. He says, as well as to bring to trial those who perpetuated numerous bloody crimes against civilians, including against citizens of the Russian Federation. Now, Putin finishes up this way. This is interesting. He tells you what his plan is. Quote, it is not our plan to occupy the Ukrainian territory. At the same time, we have been hearing an increasing number of statements coming from the West that there is no need anymore to abide by the documents setting forth the outcomes of World War II. So he says, how should we respond to that? He says, no plan to occupy Ukraine. However, Kamala Harris, 3 weeks ago, provokes him by telling him, you can count on NATO being here in Ukraine soon. They knew this would start a war. They knew this would happen. Putin says, in this context, I would like to address the citizens of Ukraine. So now he's going to speak directly to those to the people, the civilians in Ukraine. He says, we are acting to defend ourselves from the threats created for us and from a worse peril than what is happening now. I am asking you, citizens of Ukraine, however hard this may be, to understand this and to work together with us so as to turn this tragic page as soon as possible and to move forward together without allowing anyone to interfere in our affairs and our relations, but developing them independently so as to create favorable conditions for overcoming all these problems and to strengthen us from within as a single whole, despite the existence of state borders. That is a huge sentence. Anyway, he says, I believe in this and our common future. So that's his message to the citizens in Ukraine. He also has a message for the military personnel of the Ukrainian armed forces. He says, "Comrade officers, your fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers did not fight the Nazi occupiers and did not defend our common motherland to allow today's neo-Nazis to seize power in Ukraine." Now you have to know something about the culture and what's actually going on in Ukraine to realize what he's saying there. That there's actually a neo-Nazi element there. He says, "You swore the oath of allegiance to the Ukrainian people and not to the junta." What he means by that is it's the people in power in the government right now. A junta is a group of military officers that have taken over, have seized power of a country. It's a term used often in South America and Central America when there would be a coup d'etat and a new military regime would take over, is known as a junta. Anyway, so that's what he's calling what's happening in Ukraine. He says, "The people's adversary, which is plundering Ukraine and humiliating Ukrainian people." He says this to the armed forces in Ukraine. "I urge you to refuse to carry out their criminal orders. I urge you to immediately lay down arms and go home. I will explain what this means. The military personnel of Ukrainian army who do this will be able to freely leave the zone of hostilities and return to their families." Is he telling the truth there? I don't know. He's told a lot of truth. I don't know if he really means that or not, but he said it, and I haven't heard anyone on MSNBC say that he said that. He says, "I want to emphasize again that all responsibility for the possible bloodshed will lie fully and wholly with the ruling Ukrainian regime." So you can count on it. Zelensky is at the top of his list. And of course, as we pointed out today, that would serve the global movement, the globalist movement, very well. If Putin was able to take out Zelensky. In fact, as we've described to you already, all you have to do is present the body and tell everyone that it was Putin, or present the body of this activist and tell the people that the police did it. You see how this works, right? If you're just joining us, go back and watch where we described how these things are done. Putin says, "I would like to now say something very important for those who may be tempted to interfere in these developments from the outside." He's talking to all of the West now. He says, "No matter who tries to stand in our way, or all the more so create threats for our country and our people, they must know that Russia will respond immediately, and the consequences will be such as you have never seen in your entire history." What are our leaders doing? They continue to provoke this man who has said plainly, he's not afraid. He's not afraid of a nuclear option. Putin says, "No matter how the events unfold, we are ready. All the necessary decisions in this regard have been taken. I hope that my words will be heard," he says. So there he's given the direct threat. And our people, the West, as we call it, the allies, are doing no foreign policy, no diplomacy. All it is now, well, they're not instituting a no-fly zone. Seems like to me we're already at war with Russia. This idea of we're not going to do a no-fly zone because that puts us in a direct conflict with Russia, that's silly. You're already in a direct conflict with Russia. It's clear. But that's where we are. You can take all of that and do with it what you will. But there's the truth. Let me mention to you that we have some important links in the description here today. If you would like to help out, let me remind you folks, there are real, live, flesh and blood, image bearers of God in this region. Right? This is, on one hand, we have a media event happening that doesn't reflect reality at all. On the other hand, we have real people. We have Christian missionaries in this region who are in harm's way. We've put them in harm's way. Right? We have to take the responsibility for this. So we got 3 important links in the description to this video if you'd like to know how to directly support the real people involved in the region who have been affected by the war and the sanctions. Now, I would like to see more missionaries, more. I'd like to see more. I don't know if you can be a missionary in Russia at this moment, but I'd like to see more thought for the people in Russia. They haven't invaded anybody. But I'm showing you these are all Christian ministries. If you'd like to support them, there are links in the description. There are prayer requests from missionaries in Ukraine and the surrounding region. Pray for safety and comfort to all the families that are in harm's way in Ukraine and in Russia, for the families who are being affected by food shortages and rationing in Russia. Pray equally for the people of both nations and all those affected. We share a special prayer for our Christian brothers and sisters in Russia, Ukraine, and all the surrounding nation states. Pray that the Lord will strengthen the believers and the churches in the surrounding nations as they seek shelter. Pray that the Lord would provide so that they can all be fed, and so that these refugees and these people can be encouraged for whatever reason that they might be fleeing the region. Pray that the gospel of Jesus Christ would penetrate the hearts of unbelievers now and bring them to saving faith. Pray for all of God's people to be in fervent, consistent prayer for those in Ukraine as well as those in Russia. Russian civilians are not responsible for the war casualties. So some of these, we have the European Christian Mission. You'll find that link. You can read what they have, their purposes and their ministries. You can read that on their website if you like. We also have, let's see, that's European Christian Ministries. We also have the Masters Academy International. That's linked in the description as well. You can read what they're doing. They're in Ukraine. And also we have one who is in Moldova, dealing directly with children, specifically orphans. And that is this one, Crossroads Compassion Project in Moldova. We have that link for you as well. So let me, for those of you who are here, we ask you to, if you would, please support Armor of Truth. We need your help. And it seems like as we've taken a more distinct theological approach, some of our support has left us. Well, that's okay. We're not here to say what people want to hear. We're here to tell the truth and give away books. Now, if you'd like to have a copy of this book from Daryl Harrison and Virgil Walker, Why Are You Afraid? Deals specifically with what we see happening in our nation and in our world right now. It actually works out to be like a Bible study. Deals with what we see happening in our world and how to remain focused, calm, joyful, even in this time. So each chapter ends with questions and references to scriptures, so you can. It's a blessing, and it has the stamp of approval from many Christian leaders today. Phil Johnson, Executive Director of Grace to You, has supported it. Daryl Harrison and Virgil Walker, a couple guys that we met at the G3 conference this year, and this is their new book. If you would like a copy of this, just email us at hello@armoroftruth.net. All right, there's the email address. You can't see that. Let me put it up here. There's the email address. Email us at hello@armoroftruth.net and tell us you want to be on our mailing list. Listen, you have to play by the rules, okay? Just tell us you want to be on our join our mailing list, and we'll give you this book for free. All right, that's a tit for tat, right? That's fair. Just tell us you want to join our mailing list and you'd like a copy of this book. If you've already joined our mailing list and you'd like a copy of this book, you can email us and ask us, and we'll be happy to oblige you there. We have many of these to give away right now. So, Why Are You Afraid? Daryl Harrison, Virgil Walker, produced by the G3 Ministries Press. And I recommend it. Now, also, one more that I have here for you. We have a couple copies of this one left, God Doesn't Whisper. Given away quite a few of these other titles recently. We've got two of these left, God Doesn't Whisper. This is Many teach that God is whispering private revelations to his people. The spiritual harm and theological mischief spawned by this errant doctrine is incalculable. In God Doesn't Whisper, Jim Osmond has written what is, in my estimation, says Justin Peters, the definitive work on this subject. Read this book carefully, consider its arguments, and rest in the sufficiency of revealed Scripture. Justin Peter says, I simply cannot recommend this book highly enough. Jim Osmond is the pastor at Kootenai Community Church in Idaho. If you'd like one of these, you can join our mailing list and tell us that you'd like a copy of God Doesn't Whisper, and we'll send you one for free. If you are the winner, we will email you and ask you for your physical address so we can send it to you. I've read this, and it's excellent. You're gonna know the Bible. You're gonna come out of this knowing the Bible much better than you did going in, and that's the point of any book that we offer to you for free here. So thank you for joining us here today, folks. I want to encourage you, if you like to support Armor of Truth, please. Here's what it looks like. Here's our website, armoroftruth.net. Scroll down on armoroftruth.net. There you can find all our links and socials, and there's some playlists and some Bible studies. And the Culture Vault, right down here, you can see there's the Culture Vault. This is what Summer has worked on for months now, curating the Culture Vault, where you will find plenty of articles that will prepare you for what's going on in the world, and also plenty of articles that will encourage you from our Christian perspective. You'll also find our Alcoholics Anonymous Cult and Addiction series. You'll find that here as well. You'll find a link to the Armor of Truth podcast here as well. I also have a personal blog here where I have a few blogs up there. We'll be getting more of those up recently. And you can go to the donate tab here if you don't mind, if you'll support us so that we can continue to do this work for you. If you'd like to send us support or just a message, you can email us old school style, snail mail at Armor of Truth, P.O. Box 729, Hudson, North Carolina, 28638. Send us a letter, send us a message, let us know what you think about what we're doing. We have quite a few cards behind us on the wall over here. That it's always nice to see something in the P.O. Box. If you want to support us, send in support, you can send cash, that's fine. Or you can check or money order something. Just make it out to make it payable to Armor of Truth, and that'll get it done. Church finder service is something that we offer here to people. If we can find you a church, we certainly will, and we will look in your area. If you're needing to find a church, you're new to the faith, or you need to change, or you want to find your church has drifted way to the left, you need to find a church in your area. We'll do our best to help you. We can't promise that we'll find one within a reasonable distance from you, but we will try. And you can do that. The same email address, hello@armoroftruth.net, and ask us to help find a church for you in your area. And I do ask for those of you that have requested those recently, be patient with us. It takes time to research and find out what's going on with these churches. Sometimes it's hard to know for sure. And we also need your help. When those of you who we have recommended churches to, when you go and find out what's going on there, report back to us, right? Because it's hard to recommend a church that you haven't physically been to, right? That's a difficult thing to do. So you have to be extremely careful. So you can help us with this. You can help us build our church finder service to where eventually on our website you'll be able to go to the website and type in your location, and all the churches that we've collected, that we've studied, that we've researched will be presented there on a map so you can find them. So help us out with that. As we recommend these churches to you, let us know what you find there. All right, let us know what's going on, and that'll help us out a lot. Thank you for joining us today, folks. We ask that you be in prayer for everyone in the world, all right? And when we think about evil, start with yourself. Start with your own heart. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, the thin line between good and evil runs through all of our hearts. He also said, live not by lies. Live not by lies. And he was one who was kicked out of the Soviet Union, a Christian. 4, his bold stance on truth. God bless you, my friends. Lord willing, we'll see you here again on Friday for our next edition of Armor of Truth Live. We'll see you next time.
Armor of Truth Live. Faith is resistance.
I'm not against technology, Doctor. I'm against the men who deify it at the expense of human truth. Faith is resistance. I'm against the men who deify it at the expense of human truth.